culture is dying. Hell, it might already be dead. But before I get too existential, let's back up for a second. How did we get here? So I watched the first 3 episodes of Skeleton Crew, something I had no intention of doing, but based on the initial wave of positivity, figured, I'll give it a go. Let's get this out of the way first. I'm not a big Jon Watts fan. I think if you've watched any of my Spider-Man videos, you probably gather that. I'm sure he's a nice guy, a competent filmmaker. Hell, I used to like his wacky creative endeavors on YouTube with Waverly Flames, and if you watched The Old Man on FX, you know he's capable of something far more interesting than what his Spider-Man films show for. But outside of that, I can't say the guy has the sauce, In fact, he might actually be the very definition of sauceless. So, naturally, I couldn't care less about what his Star Wars show was going to be, but when I heard it would be riffing on 80s Amblin films, I couldn't help but roll my eyes. Like, really? That was your big idea for a Star Wars project? Star Wars nostalgia being cannibalized by 80s nostalgia? I don't get it. Not to mention, the vibes and aesthetics of Amblin are horribly incongruent with that of Star Wars. Like, I'm sorry, but suburbia doesn't belong in a galaxy far, far away. Hell, the latter part of that sentence, suburbia in a galaxy far, far away, feels like a paradox in and of itself. It makes no sense. It's contradictory. I couldn't think of anything I'd rather see less in the realm of Star Wars than a 1980s IP riffing on some dude's nostalgia for other 80s classics. In an era dominated by reboots, sequels, and remakes, nostalgia has become the cornerstone of culture, and that's so depressing, man. After making my way through what easily could have been the first 20 to 30 minutes of a feature-length film, but was instead an annoyingly protracted and self-indulgent first act, split up between 3 40-minute episodes, I honestly don't have much to say about Skeleton Crew. It's more or less everything I expected. Bland direction dulled further due to a surface-level understanding of what an Amblin movie is. While the series attempts to evoke the wonder of 1980s Spielbergian storytelling, it inadvertently underscores a larger, more troubling issue: the stagnation of contemporary culture, driven by an over-reliance on the past. Skeleton Crew represents the absolute nadir of this phenomenon, and while it might not be the most offensive effort put forth by Lucasfilm, especially off the heels of The Acolyte and, the Book of Boba Fett and other literally anything that isn't Andor, it's certainly their most obnoxious on a conceptual level. I get it. The Goonies in space is appealing to people. I've never been one for the Goonies myself. Sorry, Richard Donner, maybe they should have said die, but I see a way to take the basic premise and take it in a fun direction, really doubling down on the pirate aesthetics, making it feel like a far-away space pirate adventure, focusing more on funneling Treasure Planet, which should be the blueprint for this entire fucking series, through the lens of Star Wars. Maybe not going full steampunk like they did in Treasure Planet, but, steampunk adjacent. Something that just feels fantastical and otherworldly. That would be real fucking cool, and you'd still manage to capture the more adventurous spirit of Star Wars while offering something new. However, as we know, that's not what this show is. No, this show is kids in the suburbs, not too dissimilar from our own, eating fucking Wheaties with blue milk before catching the bus to go to school, while his overworked dad leaves with a briefcase to jet over for his performance review. Oh my god, I wanted to vomit. It was, talk about a lack of imagination. The showrunners can't even think of a creative way to conceptualize suburban life in space except to just literally put the suburbs in space, recycling the cultural tropes of the past instead of building something authentically new. Now, to be fair to John Watts and co., maybe that's part of the point. After 2 episodes, it's clear that this planet is isolated in some shape or form, cut off from the rest of the galaxy, prospering in a bubble as if to make a commentary, unintended or not, about the privileged seclusion and isolationism that comes with the suburbs, how that withdrawal from the outside world prevents you from engaging with it, from gaining a greater understanding and sense of empathy for the world around you. However, with the big treasure of the show being hidden within this suburban planet, I can't help but feel like there's gonna be some weird unintended message about those suburbs nostalgia being the treasure. And I fully acknowledge that's me assuming, like I haven't seen the full series, so I don't know, but it doesn't take away from how weary I'm feeling towards this series already. The show's suburban imagery not only feels derivative, but also dissonant within the Star Wars universe. Star Wars has always had a fantasy element that whisks us away to strange new worlds and allows us to escape for 2 hours. Places like the deserts of Tatooine, the forests of Endor, the palaces of Naboo, or the Blade Runner-inspired underbelly of Coruscant. These were places that, sure, took elements of cities, landscapes, and architecture from our world, but used that as a foundation to build out completely foreign and new environments. George Lucas created imaginative new worlds and transported audiences there. To transplant the mundane trappings of 1980s suburbia into this universe practically as a one-to-one feels lazy and unimaginative. It's as if the creators lacked the vision to conceptualize what suburban life might look like in a galaxy far, far away, opting instead to slap a Star Wars veneer onto a generic 80s setting. The prequels, like them or not, integrated tons of 50s retro future aesthetics into their worlds, especially on Coruscant. There was Dex's Diner, for instance, something I know many of you probably rolled your eyes at the time, but Lucas found a way to massage a 50s New York-style diner into the world of Star Wars without it feeling like a copy and paste of a place you ordered black coffee, bacon, and eggs at in Manhattan. The characters are otherworldly, yet recognizable. It's fully steeped in fantasy. Even the nightclubs have this Elseworld, dystopian, Blade Runner-inspired vibe to them. Yeah, I'm gonna be using Blade Runner to it because the underbelly of Coruscant is basically just a cyberpunk reality. The sporting events on the TVs in Attack of the Clones isn't quite discernible, but you get the culture around it. Same with the pod races. Clearly, it was inspired by Lucas's love of cars and racing, but it's delivered to us in a way that's drastically different from our own world. When the Jedi kids go to school, it's nothing like a school you or I go to. It's part monastery, part Vatican City, and ancient library. Now, granted, that could very well be because they're Jedi and their education is different, but based on what we've seen in the original trilogy and prequels, it wouldn't be a stretch to imagine a classroom adjacent to that. The point is, Star Wars is no stranger to incorporating aspects of our modern world into the fabric of its mythology or environment. The reason it works, however, is because George Lucas is famously interested in anthropology and finding the similarities and differences across cultures. He remixes the past, present, and our idea of the future to create the feeling of something distant and foreign. Old but modern, technologically advanced, but rooted in the designs and tools of an ancient civilization. It is, in the truest sense, a fantasy. Lucas himself has even said, "The trouble with the future in most futuristic movies is that it always looks new and clean and shiny. What is required for true credibility is a used future." This lack of imagination on the parts of Skeleton Crew is particularly frustrating and glaring when compared to other recent Star Wars projects like Andor. Y'all know I love Andor. It's like the greatest thing Disney Star Wars has ever made. That series could have very easily fumbled the government bureaucracy but in space thing, but it took the time to massage those ideas into the fabric of Star Wars instead of just slapping a coat of space paint over a standard political thriller and calling it a day. No, that's not what Andor did. Even the apartment life we see in the film on Coruscant is so different from what the domestic life in Skeleton Crew is. The way that Tony Gilroy captured Andor that made it feel authentic to Star Wars, and specifically that point in time, whereas with Skeleton Crew, Like, that could have been any family at any point in time in like an alternate version of the 80s where we were more technologically advanced. And that's the problem. That's just lame. In contrast to Andor, Skeleton Crew feels like a show designed for adults, nostalgic for their childhoods rather than for today's children, which is a problem when your story is being told from the perspective of children, one of the series' few bright ideas squandered by execution in an attempt to court younger viewers. This is your dad's idea of Star Wars for kids, and boy, is Dad out of touch, resulting in a show so strange and disconnected that's symptomatic of a much larger issue. Kids aren't just inheriting recycled franchises, they're left to consume secondhand nostalgia. The overuse of 1980s aesthetics in modern media can largely be traced back to the success of Stranger Things, a show I admittedly like, hell, love even, but I don't love it for being an 80s nostalgia grab bag. The synthwave aesthetic, pastiche drawn from the decade's pop culture, is fun in the context of the show, but what made Stranger Things resonate was not its nostalgic trappings, but its strong character work and storytelling. The 80s gimmick was a vehicle for the narrative, not the narrative itself. It allowed the Duffer Brothers to tell the story they wanted to tell, and it was clearly inspired by a deep love and passion for Stephen King, not some vague, half-remembered idea of the 80s or Amblin, as is the case with Skeleton Crew. As is tradition, the industry unfortunately saw the success of Stranger Things as a call to double down on nostalgia, particularly 80s nostalgia, leading to an onslaught of 80s-inspired media. The result is a creative landscape saturated with half-baked homages to Amblin, Spielberg, and other Gen X cultural touchstones. I get Star Wars is also Gen X nostalgia, technically, but it lived on beyond that. It evolved, it brought in new viewers. The constant homages to the Amblin aesthetic are so tiring, especially since most Amblin films weren't even like this. Steven Spielberg brought a deeply personal authenticity to those oft-referenced works that were rooted in his own upbringing and relationships. The strained, familial relationships, absent fathers, and childlike sense of wonder weren't just boxes that needed to be checked. These were elements of Spielberg that he just happened to infuse into his work, like any artist does. The filmmakers he brought on board to helm other Amblin projects like Richard Donner with the Goonies, and especially Joe Dante with Gremlins and Explorers, all were brought into the Amblin fold because they each had a distinct voice and perspective to offer an audience. They weren't trying to make movies that fit the Amblin criteria, they were just trying to make movies. Joe Dante was so confident in his voice as a filmmaker, and he understood how to tailor it for a wider audience, thanks in part to his time working on Roger Corman films and directing Piranha. He just also happened to have sensibilities that could align with the movie-going audience, and Spielberg recognized that. He recognized that Dante's dark, Chuck Jones, Looney Tunes-esque approach to blending horror with comedy was uniquely innovative, yet accessible, even if the suits at the time didn't necessarily get it, as was the case with Gremlins initially. He took what could have been a very straightforward story with something like Small Soldiers and gave it a bit of B-movie pizzazz with the Chuck Jones, Tex Avery edge that elevates the whole film. As was the case with most Amblin films, Gremlins, for example, was an extension of Dante's personality and the multitude of works he was influenced by, similar to George Lucas and Steven Spielberg being inspired by James Bond, Republic serials, and pulp heroes with Indiana Jones. As Dante said, reflecting on the success of Gremlins, "I'll never do something that'll outlast that in terms of the public image of who I am, which is fine with me. It expresses my personality too, which is the one thing that's the most difficult to get across in an expensive film." That's what made it special. That's what made Gremlins the kind of film only Joe Dante, Chris Columbus, and Steven Spielberg could tell. Hell, the concept alone was birthed from Chris Columbus's fear of the unsettling sound of mice scurrying across his floor at night as he lay awake in his loft. The problem with these Amblin-inspired projects is they're riffing on the base level idea of an Amblin film without recognizing that Amblin is just the company. The stories came from a personal place of artistic expression where the blending of influence and personal experience made them what they were. When you riff on nostalgia, you get the most surface-level interpretation of what made that original work so great. These riffs largely boil down to vague attempts at turning Spielberg into a genre, which is so strange to me since Spielberg is one of the most unabashedly distinct and personalized voices in the industry. Sure, I get it, he's an inspiration. Anyone who's a filmmaker is probably inspired by Spielberg in some way, shape, or form. But he's not a genre, and it's clear more executives and company filmmakers view him as the latter than the former, resulting in a wave of Amblin-inspired content that feels hollow and soulless. My good friend and editor at the playlist, Rodrigo Perez, put it best in his Skeleton Crew review when he said, "Skeleton Crew is an appropriation for a halcyon era of cinema and little else. Worse, the exceptional Spielbergian tenor of marvel and amazement is absent, leaving behind a mostly hollow, fairly unremarkable, forgettable product." This over-reliance on nostalgia has not only stunted creative innovation, but also alienated younger audiences. This disconnect highlights a broader issue. Many creatives and executives lack an understanding of what resonates with today's youth, leading to entertainment that feels out of touch. The entertainment industry's nostalgia fixation has profound implications for the broader culture. By continuously recycling the same ideas, aesthetics, and narratives, we risk creating a generation that knows nostalgia as the defining cultural characteristic of their time. This culture, or lack thereof, deprives younger generations of original stories, franchises, pieces of culture that reflect their own experiences and struggles that they can call their own. There's nothing to define them. I remember when I was a kid and we had this massive boom of original IP in the early 2000s. Granted, some of it was inspired by literature, even theme park rides if you can believe that, but they were interpreted in a way that we hadn't seen before. Pirates of the Caribbean, outside of the Disneyland ride, didn't exist, but it sure does now as this massive franchise. I mean, we got Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, the Dark Knight trilogy, the Pixar Renaissance, Avatar, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, the Bourne movies. Hell, you could even throw the Star Wars prequels in there given how radically different they were from the previous trilogy of films. I mean, I could go on. It was an embarrassment of riches, and that's just the film side of things. Those films were massively important in how we grew, matured, and processed the world around us, especially in the wake of 9/11. We took ownership of them. It was our culture. TV, film, media in general has just given up on kids, which feels weird to say given how much of the landscape, especially on television, is devoted to children's IP, but none of it is made for kids. Even the stuff that ostensibly is has no clue what kids today are like or what their lived experience is. Somewhere amidst the birth of the Legacy sequel and the explosion of the MCU, we just decided that culture stopped in like 2000 whatever, and now all we can do is replay the hits to a smaller and smaller audience. It's why kids have gravitated to online content even more than before, because at least that stuff appears to understand what their lives are like and or attempts to reflect the world they live in. Most of it doesn't. Most of it is meaningless short-form nonsense that prioritizes virality over substance, but it's fresh and exciting. Platforms like YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and general meme culture have filled the void left by mainstream media, offering content that feels more immediate, relatable, and engaging. While this shift has democratized content creation, which is a net positive, brain rot has mostly taken over because there was a vacuum in terms of professionally made entertainment for kids. So you can't really blame those same kids for liking shit like Skibbity Toilet when the entertainment industry refused to meet them halfway. The lack of meaningful representation in mainstream media has also contributed to a sense of alienation among young audiences. When today's children and teenagers look to the media, they rarely see their lives, concerns, or realities reflected. Instead, they are inundated with stories and aesthetics that cater to the nostalgia of previous generations. This disconnect extends far beyond entertainment, influencing how young people engage with politics and society at large. I mean, just look at the last few elections. If they feel unheard and unseen, why should they participate in systems or industries that seem to disregard them? Historically, the entertainment industry thrived on bold, innovative ideas. Directors like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas became icons by being afforded the opportunity and budget to create original, large-scale films that took the world by storm and created culture. We don't do that anymore. Filmmakers must first prove themselves within the confines of existing IP, often compromising their creative vision before they are entrusted with the resources to pursue original projects. Even then, as evidenced by the backlash against The Last Jedi, attempts to innovate within established franchises can prove to be difficult and met with resistance. Meanwhile, the deluge of content on streaming ensures audiences remain atomized and nothing remains in the cultural zeitgeist for too long. Literally every single aspect of the industry seems designed to prevent new ideas from taking hold. And you'd wonder why that is, because new ideas are how the industry became the industry. It's how it grows and expands and how culture continues to evolve and be culture. We're going to look back at this time as being remarkably short-sighted, but ultimately damaging beyond belief for us as a society. It's why horror is in the midst of a massive renaissance. Indie filmmakers are afforded the opportunity to cut their teeth on fresh, exciting, innovative ideas, and the genre is arguably the only one that's managed to balance nostalgia with originality. It's creating new fans of not only the genre, but of original ideas. Films like Get Out, Midsommar, and the X trilogy have revitalized the genre, even as franchises like Halloween and Scream continue to draw on nostalgia in new and subversive ways. It's all because the industry still largely devalues horror as a genre, looks at it as being inferior, B-movie entertainment, nothing serious. And honestly, thank God for that. If it means we get bolder ideas, I'm all for it. However, the success of horror as a bastion for originality is itself becoming a crutch, with more filmmakers turning to the genre as the only viable avenue for creative expression, which can become its own form of exhaustion. To break free from this cycle of cultural stagnation, we need to invest in the upcoming George Lucas's and Steven Spielberg's of the world. I mean, look at someone like Christopher Nolan. He is leading the charge in original filmmaking. He's basically got carte blanche to make whatever the hell he wants to make, but he didn't start out that way. He made the Batman movies, but he didn't just make Batman movies, he made his version of Batman movies, the version only Christopher Nolan could make. We need more of that. Mostly inspired by James Bond. I mean, look at all the pieces in there. Bruce Wayne might as well be James, and Lucius Fox might as well be Q, and the missions that he goes on, the villains that he faces are very Bond adjacent. It's not a one-to-one, but it's clear that Nolan was inspired by outside influences. A Tale of Two Cities inspired The Dark Knight Rises. Stuff like A Clockwork Orange was integral in crafting the aesthetic of the Joker. And Batman Begins, I mean, that's about as close as Christopher Nolan's gonna get to a Bond film outside of Tenet. My point being, Christopher Nolan wasn't just making Batman movies based on what Batman should be. He was pulling in outside influences. He was pulling in stuff that excited him, that made him the filmmaker he was today. And we need more of that. We need more filmmakers tackling big ideas, big IPs that have that boldness, that are allowed to go in that direction. We have to move beyond superficial attempts to replicate past aesthetics and instead seek to dream up stories that are in conversation with the state of the world around us, that are actually interested in making the next generations a part of that conversation by attempting to understand them as a viewer. They need to give the budgets they're giving to company men like John Watts and Jon Favreau. Basically, if you're named John and work for Disney, fuck you. No, JK, I'm just loving you. I'm just kidding. It's a joke. Please, it's a joke. To the Rian Johnsons of the world to make new mainstream entertainment like he did with Knives Out after Lucasfilm threw him under the bus for taking an inspired creative risk that was more in line with what the populist filmmakers of the 80s they so adore were doing at the time and refusing to stand by him. Studios need to invest in emerging talent and provide the resources necessary for ambitious, large-scale projects that can define a new era of pop culture. Rian Johnson created a series of murder mystery films inspired by his deep love of Agatha Christie and the twisty, subversive nature of the genre, much like how Joe Dante, Steven Spielberg, and George Lucas created their signature classics. Knives Out was a bona fide hit. It became a classic and has the box office receipts to prove it, grossing about $312.9 million. This proves that there is a market for fresh ideas, a hunger for them, even within a landscape dominated by IP of the past. I know this may seem like an overreaction to the release of a new Disney Plus Star Wars show. I mean, it probably is, honestly, but it's the first time I felt absolutely nothing but numb apathy toward the latest entry in a franchise I used to love so dearly. Maybe I'm yearning for something that people don't want, something impossible. Maybe I'm wrong and have simply outgrown Star Wars. Maybe, but if outgrowing Star Wars means breaking a cycle of creative inbreeding and finally progressing with my life and what I expect and deserve from my entertainment, then so be it. The release of Skeleton Crew highlights the extent to which nostalgia has become the primary driving force in pop culture, often to its detriment. While there's no denying nostalgia can be employed to great effect and be a powerful tool for storytelling, its overuse has led to a creative stagnation that alienates younger audiences and stifles the development of new ideas. By recognizing the limitations of nostalgia and investing in originality, even within existing franchises, as we saw with The Last Jedi or Shane Black's Iron Man 3, we can begin to create a culture that speaks to the present and inspires the future. As the MCU has yet to figure out in its post-Endgame existence on life support, sometimes we have to recognize when the story, the nostalgia, should end so we can move forward and start anew. We can't live in a world where stories go on forever with no conclusion, floating in a purgatory of nostalgia, because that's not what life is. Without this shift, we risk leaving entire generations with little more than the echoes of a bygone era as they become a skeleton crew of a humanity that once was.
I'm just like you, okay? I'm lost. I'm alone.